law, and they came to situations that God had to work in their lives. That He brought them down to nothing, basically. He just took them down to nothing, and they lost everything. And then but they still had a word from God that something was going to happen. There's going to be bread in Bethlehem, where they came from, and so there was a famine, and they were going to go back. This is just a little brief summary of basically a whole lot of what we talked about last week. So we're going to continue on. We had 4 parts that I mentioned. We looked at 2. First of all, the triumph of the risen life. There's the way of the risen life. There's a way in Christ. There is a way. And secondly, there's the obedience of risen life. If you have Christ living in you, there's an obedience there that we must follow through on. And then there's this, we're going to have today, the spirit of the risen life. Our mind is changed, and our spirit has a desire for risen life, and we can understand risen life by our spirit. And then fourthly, the power of the risen life, the power of resurrection, the power of the obedience of resurrection, the way of resurrection, and the spirit of resurrection. So looking into that aspect of things in the little book of Ruth, you might ask this question: when does that resurrection morning appear? We're Easter time now, and we're thinking of the resurrection, and the fact is that we're looking at the triumph of His risen life. When does that resurrection appear in us? When does the morning appear? If you had a very bad night, when's the morning come? And then when did we rise from death of self? The Lord's taken us into the death of self at Calvary. When do we rise in this? When do we actually come into something that's living? When do we share Christ's life? When our roots are fixed in heaven? Something is very fickle with our lives here. They come and they go. But when do we have something fixed? It's not going to move. Fixed in heaven. When do we begin to breathe celestial air? When do we begin, our spiritual lungs begin to recognize that we're in heavenly places? I want to begin to breathe things that are ours in Christ. This triumph of the Lord. We might say also, when do we reach those heights, those lofty heights